Okay, obviously first up, just who you are, a little bit about your career, where you started and where you are now, kind of thing.
Okay. So I'm a journalist who started about 25 years ago in radio and television, and I quickly developed an interest in the High Court and the proceedings and criminal cases. So I've spent a lot of my career in courtrooms, tracking down, investigators and interviewing them, prosecutors, and the story behind the headlines. And that's basically, my background.
What kind of courtroom cases? Was it like crime, or was it everything from corruption to murder? What was the kind of...
I covered everything. So I started off when I was a more junior reporter in the magistrates' courts, which really taught you about the processes. It was a lot less organized than the high courts, which are very smooth running. The lower courts can be a little bit more chaotic. And I did crime right through, but I also did parliament, so I also ended up doing a lot of political cases as well, a lot of corruption. There were some civil cases that I covered as well, but mostly it came back to crime. The major crime stories I would cover.
And why do you think people have such a fascination? Because every time there's like anything from a Jason Road to it's like literally the whole country is fascinated by it. What do you think it is that makes us so interested in it?
I think there's certain crimes that really capture the public's imagination. For example, the Jason Roeder case. That was a very good-looking man, had a beautiful wife, had two beautiful twin daughters, absolutely looked like the perfect family, but what's happening behind closed doors is something completely different. It's a man who was actually having an affair. There were a lot of problems in the marriage, and then it's did he actually do it? When there's that question, it could be one way or the other. People become fascinated and they all want to weigh in on it, and they all have an opinion. Some people are convinced that Jason Roeder is guilty of that crime. Other people remain convinced that he is innocent. The same goes for the Ingelots case. That was, again, a beautiful young girl in Stellenbosch University, brilliant, clever, wonderful, an only child, the perfect life, seemingly, with a beautiful, handsome boyfriend. Yet she was murdered in a terribly brutal fashion, and her boyfriend was arrested. Now, as we all know, Fred van der Vyver was eventually acquitted, but the question remains to this day, could he have done it and gotten away with murder? The evidence says no, he didn't, but in the public's mind, it remains a question, and I think people are always fascinated when there's that element of doubt.
And when it comes to kind of religious crimes like Satanism, the minute someone says I was possessed or I did this because, or when they use it as an excuse, there's kind of this like satanic panic that takes over. Why do you think we're also so obsessed with that?
I think, anything to do with the occult is terrifying, scary, and, we're drawn to the fear, we're drawn to the excitement of something that we don't know that much about. And it becomes fascinating when somebody can be brainwashed by a cult, can be brainwashed by Satan, can be told to do things, and it's not themselves doing it, it's some other higher power. So it becomes fascinating for the public. How is that even possible? They want to know more, and I think those satanic killings make people want to really just know more about the case and the terrible details involved.
What kind of process would you have gone through to cover a case? Like, where do you start? Where do you finish? Who do you phone? Like, how do they kind of land on your desk? Do you choose what you want to cover, or?
I think, I was covering a lot of the very high profile cases which were already in the headlines. Those cases happen and we'll cover it from start to finish. So that involves going to the first court appearance, going to every court appearance, and then trying to find those peripheral characters, whether it's the loved ones of the victim or the loved ones of the accused, finding other people to talk about those cases. It depended on what job I was doing at the time. I've been a broadcast journalist and a radio journalist, so it would either be reporting on these things on a daily basis, or when I was covering a documentary, for example, it would be a longer process which would involve reenactments, and actually traveling to families, to people who had been left behind, to psychologists who had been involved in the cases, and then really just tracking down all those key members who were involved in those particular murder cases.
Do you think it takes a specific kind of person? Sorry, I just need to take a photo of this thing while I'm there. Do you think it takes a specific type of person to be able to be a journalist just in general, because you have to break through quite a lot of barriers to get information, and specifically someone who focuses on crime?
I think being a journalist is a very draining job. It can be particularly draining, particularly when you're sitting in a courtroom all day and you are privy to those exceptionally heartbreaking photographs of crimes, of wounds, of the measurements of cuts. It becomes very technical and detailed, but at the same time you're sitting in a courtroom where there's raw emotion, where family members are sitting there sobbing their eyes out. For me personally, and I can't speak for other journalists, but I found crime has been a very difficult thing to cover. I'm quite sensitive, and I took home a lot of the grief that I saw in court. I luckily am fortunate. I have a sister who's also a journalist, and between the two of us, we could debrief. We covered a lot of the same cases. A lot of my friends are journalists, and you tend to process these things with your colleagues. Many journalists who cover crime become affected, maybe not by every single case, but certainly there'll be cases that stick in their minds, that they can't let go of, that they'll always remember, testimony that you hear of victims on the stand it makes you cry sitting in the court gallery. So it's you can't divorce yourself from it completely. We're there to do a job, we're there to deliver the news, we're there to write the facts into a cohesive story, but at the end of the day, when you go home, you do still see those images of those terrible crime scenes, and they linger.
And it's almost like you're doing a similar job to what the police are doing. You're interviewing people, you're trying to find facts, you're investigating, but you're not seen in the same, you're almost seen sometimes as a hindrance to, you know what I mean, even though you're fulfilling such an important role. It's like,
I think that one feels at times a bit vulture-like when you come into a crime situation where you're not necessarily assisting the investigation. And I think we try to be very conscious of that. If you're on a crime scene, you have to step back. You can't go rushing in. You can't. And even though you can be the first on a crime scene, or the first journalist on a crime scene, it doesn't mean that you should have access to it and be able to mess with that crime scene. So there has to be respect for what the investigators have to do. And of course, we need to do our jobs, they need to do theirs. Sometimes we work well together. Sometimes the police do see us as a hindrance. They don't want us to break news that they don't want in the public before it reaches the courtroom. So that can also impact on court cases. So you've got to be very careful, because on the one hand, you want to break that news, or you want to reveal something that you've discovered, but you actually might need to wait until you get to that court case and that evidence is heard in court, because you really can jeopardize a court case. So it's a fine line, and we certainly, all the journalists I know are very respectful of that line.
what are some standout cases in your career that you will never forget?
There was a case that I covered when I was pregnant with my first child, and it was the case of Sasha Lee Crook, and she was an 8-year-old little girl who had been staying with her grandparents. Her mother was at work, and her mother was going to meet her at a birthday party and meet her parents there too. And this little girl had been playing in the front yard, and she'd been lured next door by the neighbour under the pretext of playing with the little child who lived there. And he was never convicted of sexual assault, but that was one of the charges, and he murdered her. And her body was found weeks later, and the mother spent hours and weeks looking for her little girl, and she was right next door, and it was extremely sad. Her body was eventually dumped in a field and found, but she is haunted by the fact that her daughter's body was next door for some time. They don't know how long, but she was right next door. She was right under their nose. And I was pregnant with my daughter, and I'd never been, you know, it was the first time I was becoming a mum, and I had such love for this unborn child, and I just couldn't imagine the pain of that mother. And during the trial, I became heavily pregnant by the time the trial started, and I became very close to the mom and would hug her after court, would see her there. She never missed a single solitary hearing, which was interesting because a lot of victims' mothers or close family members can't bear to hear what's being said in court, but she forced herself. I thought she was such a strong and resilient woman, and she had another child at the time, that was a baby, so she was dealing with that other child as well, and this terrible loss, and her grief and her resilience and her strength and her coming to court every day just stayed with me for years. And then eventually, several years after the incident, we did a documentary on her, and by this time her daughter was the same age as Sasha was at the time that she was murdered, and it was incredible to see how she's managed to pick up her life and continue. But Sasha, her daughter Sasha Lee, will always be this memory and part of her, and she will never let go of that.
Yeah, and it's just the same as this Lee Adams case that Gaynor, the mom, was telling us that she had the sleepless night because he never came home, and then the police kind of knew. She thinks that they knew that he'd been killed because they'd already heard that there was a body, but they still made her drive around the neighborhood and ask people if they'd seen him. Like, it was just...
And pack a school bag, remember?
Yo.
Said that the cop said to her, pack a school bag.
Oh my God.
Yeah, no. Yo, terrible.